This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is June the 3rd, 154th day of the year. 211 days remain the year's over with. Holidays and observances. World Bicycle Day. World Cider Day, National Egg Day, National Chocolate Macaroon Day, Chimborazo Day, climb a hill, climb a mountain, set yourself a metaphorical mountain goal to honor the tallest mountain the world's measured from the Earth's core. Chimborazo. It's Mabo Day, National Repeat Day, Insect Repellent Awareness Day, Love Conquers All Day, National Scent Day, World Clubfoot Day, and a National Sommelier Day. That's the guy that does the wine, you know. National Fishing and Boating Week, America the Beautiful Week, Medicare Fraud Prevention Week, National Commuter Challenge. All right, all that having been said, let's see what's in the news. The older suspect turned to Molotov cocktails after his attempt to buy a gun was blocked. He is a undocumented immigrant from Egypt and had a lot of USAID paperwork in his car when he was caught. Which makes you wonder exactly what the Biden administration was up to. Girl who refused to stand on the podium with a trans athlete was badly treated by officials. Biden's final act, his pardons, being investigated. Amid concerns over his state of mind, the fact that he probably didn't sign them. Somebody came up with it and signed them with an auto pen. The World Series champ calls out ALC over her response to the Boulder attack. She wrote a post on social media on Monday saying she was horrified by the attack. But she said her heart is with the victims and the Jewish communities across the country. World Series, the two-time World Series champ who is Jewish, called her out and wondered what she's done to confront those who call for intifadas in New York. Mayor Bowser hit with an ethics complaint over her lavish undisclosed trips. She is, a lot of officials are above having to explain things. She is the mayor of Washington, D.C. Her name is Muriel Bowser. Complaint was filed by the Foundation for Accountability and Civic Trust. Requests the Board of Ethics and Government Accountability investigated for allegedly accepting illegal travel and hospitality gifts on high-profile trips to Doha, Qatar, for the 2023 United Nations Climate Change Conference. Now that's a boondoggle for you. Well, there's a video that shows an escaped New Orleans inmate pleading to President Trump for help. I mean, he's an escapee, but he wants the president to help him. Well, Roseanne Barr is living in Texas, had a tractor accident. Judges removed the woman from the courtroom after there was an outburst from her during the Diddy trial. Prosecutor slammed expert wavering on John O'Keefe's injuries at the Karen Reed trial. And doctors are revealing how protein supports longevity and healthy aging. Trump's education chief has made her case to revive U.S. dominance. We'll see how that works out. Ohio warns the state AGs after uncovering non-citizen voters across 8 states. Under the Biden administration, everything goes. Just because you're not a citizen doesn't mean you can't vote. The Treasury Secretary has confronted a CBS host over past tariff inflation predictions as the rates hit a 4-year low. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called out CBS's Face the Nation anchor, Margaret Brennan, on Sunday for warning in March that the Trump administration's tariffs on imported goods would cause prices across the country to go up. It didn't quite work out that way. Judge has thrown out California's lawsuit over the Trump tariffs, citing jurisdiction issues. Let's see. Tech giant Links just signed a 20-year deal with an energy company for nuclear power. Tourists make historical and significant discovery while exploring South Carolina beach. Remains found in Edisto Island, connect to a 19th century Eddingsville beach community. Ex-Olympic star Maurice Green reacts after a high school girl gets disqualified over fire extinguisher celebration. You can be transgender in spite of President Trump's orders, but if you do something that offends the sensibility of officials, oh, you're in trouble now. There's a Trump administration is trying to undo Biden's oil restriction. MSNBC's new lineup has floundered as Jen Psaki. Her ratings have tanked compared to her predecessors. Alrighty. Well, our show today is going to be about vanishing islands. For example, Sarah Ann Island, located just north of the equator, and duly noted by astronomers is directly in the path of a total solar eclipse scheduled for June 8th, 1937. Scientists are going to set up an observation post on the island. There was no others in the vicinity. So the Pacific Fleet went out in December 1937 in search for the island. But the astronomers were somewhat disappointed. Sarah Ann Island had vanished. It's never been located again. Imagine the perplexity of Captain Cornwallis and Horsburgh. These two men at different times sailed over an area around 600 miles northwest of Tristan da Cunha in the South Atlantic, charted site of Saxonburg Island. There was no question that the island of Saxonburg existed. Captain Calloway of the American schooner Fanny described the island as low-lying and supporting a high-peaked hill at the center. He had it in view for over 4 hours. Last seen in 1860, him a captain head of the True Britain under English registry. The True Britain had Saxonburg in her sights for over 6 hours. The members of the crew also mentioned the peaked hill in the middle of the island. When Captain Cornwallis approached that area in 1821, no island. Several years later, Captain Horsburgh explored the same area, equally dumbfounded. Added to confusion, soundings taken at the location said the depth was about 2,000 fathoms. That's about 12,000 feet. So what happened to Sarah Ann and the Saxonburg Islands? Both of these islands were seen by more than one ocean-going vessel, and both were geographically located on official maps and charts. There's so little reason to doubt the existence of Sarah Ann that scientists are even planning on building an observation post on it. But, surprise, surprise, subsequent voyages to these found islands failed to locate them. Now, the phenomena of vanishing islands has been with us for centuries. I'm going to talk about some of the more classic cases on record. Talk about some of the more popular speculation. You know, one of the theories is that the Pacific Ocean bed, which is the region reporting more vanishing islands than any other, is extremely unstable. The floor of the ocean contains a lot of faults and is the scene of volcanic eruptions. The islands are frequently formed of these volcanic thrust, some of them coming from depths of 16,000 feet or more. And coming from such an unstable source and forming largely of porous volcanic material, these islands obviously have only a tenuous hold on existence, completely at the mercy of wind and wave. And Neptune, who gives birth to him, may follow the example of his father Cronus and actually swallow his spawn in another submarine upheaval. Well, such a situation is illustrated by the birth of two islands that rose out of the Pacific. They're about 200 miles south of Tokyo. February 1946, a British warship in the vicinity saw the birth of these islands and noted that the cones reached a height of 50 feet. These islands occupied an area of about a square mile. It was decided that the two cones represented one landmass, and the British Admiralty appropriately named it Urania Island after the vessel that had discovered it. 2 months later, Urania Island had degenerated into a shoal, occupying a considerably larger area. And it's this type of appearing and disappearing that has confounded cartographers and geographers for decades, causing them to alternately place and then remove islands from their maps. Notice set of mystery islands an interesting fate when they were discovered early in the 1760s by the sailing vessel the Aurora. Captain discovered them somewhere southeast of the Falklands and named them the Auroras after his ship. And after this initial sighting, they were seen by several other vessels and were eventually surveyed by a Danish ship equipped for the task. The position was entered on all the official maps, and they remained there had not a certain captain sailing through the area decided to visit the islands. He plotted his course and arrived at the place marked Auroras on the map, but there were no Auroras. The captain searched the area in astonishment and finally was forced to conclude that for all practical purposes the islands had vanished. Well, separate searches were conducted in 1820 and 1822. Other vessels have also explored the general vicinity, but no clue to the existence of the Auroras has ever shown up. And because they were seen by so many ships before their disappearance was noted, it's believed the islands actually existed at one time. Question becomes, where'd they go? Part of this problem may be caused by errors in navigation. These errors caused the Solomon Islands to be lost for almost 200 years after their discovery in 1567. Finally rediscovered in 1760. actually strategically important in World War II. For the span of a few days in its enigmatic career, Easter Island, with its stone faces, was severely misplaced. In 1928, a stunned captain informed the world by ship's radio that Easter Island had vanished. When a gunboat from Valparaiso, Chile came out to investigate, the island was found at its charted latitude and longitude. So admittedly, errors occur and shouldn't be overlooked when investigating the disappearance of an island. But what would you do with the classic case of Bouvet and Thompson Islands? 1739, Antarctic explorer Pierre de Loziers Bouvet discovered an island about 1,500 miles from the Cape of Good Hope. He described it as being 5 miles diameter and partially covered by a glacier. As its initial discovery, Bouvet Island played cat and mouse with Captain Cook in 1772 and 1775, and with Captain Furneaux in 1774. Neither captain could locate the island. Its existence was in grave doubt when in 1808 two sealing vessels, the Snow Swan and the Otter, both reported having seen it. And to further erase anybody's doubts, the 1822 Captain Benjamin Morrow claimed to have landed on the island and killed a number of seals. 1825, two whaling vessels visited Bouvet. One of them was the Sprightly, whose skipper sighted additional landmasses. Captain George Norris completely circumvented an island he called Thompson and noted there were more rocky islets that he named the Chimneys. All four islands were located 45 miles northeast of Bouvet. And for a time, these islands were in fact recorded on all the Admiralty charts, until two expeditions, one in 1843 and one in 1845, failed to find any sign of them. Captain of these two vessels agreed they were phantoms, and the islands were accordingly removed from the charts. But Bouvet Island refused to be treated in such a manner. Over the ensuing decades, it was sighted by three other vessels. Captain of one ship even drew several sketches of it. As you might guess, confusion reigned at this point. When the island was on the maps, it couldn't be found. When it was removed from the maps, various captains kept bumping into it. Finally, in 1898, the German ship Valdivia definitely located Bouvet Island, exactly where Pierre Bouvet had said it was 154 years earlier. The Valdivia failed to I can't read my handwriting. Well, the Valdivia failed to discover Captain Norris's Thompson Island or the Chimneys, leaving their existence under the shadow of doubt. Subsequently, three more vessels positioned Bouvet Island, and as of 1917, it's officially existed and is marked on all the charts. Thompson Island and the Chimneys, which Norris plotted as being 45 miles northeast of Bouvet, remain unaccounted for to this day. Maybe they'll appear in the future, occupying the same place allotted to them by Captain Norris. But the case of St. Juan de Lisbon, another spectral island drenched in history and confusion. It was discussed by W.N. Neal in his November 1921 issue of the Occult Review. According to him, this island is supposedly located somewhere in the South India Ocean, positioned in the general area east of Madagascar and south of Mascarenes. For a century and a half, this independent little island managed to elude the French government's efforts to add it to the French possessions in the Mascarena archipelago. But St. Juan de Lisboa still refused to go along with the group. And to this day, it's baffles cartographers. The first mention of St. Juan de Lisbon came from Monsieur de la Roche Saint Andre, who was sent to Madagascar in 1655. Using a Portuguese map of the area, he searched for the island but couldn't find it. And for a time, interest in the island waned. Then in 1704, a large number of men included the island in their memoirs, giving careful descriptions of the island and its appearance. These men fanned the flame of interest in the place, and there was a lot of official encouragement to add the island to the crown for the glory of France. 1721, Louis XV ordered the Chevalier de Lyon to take possession of St. Juan in the name of France. And though he searched extensively and diligently, he was forced to turn back in disappointment. The island wasn't to be found. When French colonial governor Bonnet was set sail for his new post, his list of instructions included the finding of St. Juan and its annexation. Eventually, he gave up in total bafflement. French government was convinced the island existed, but the ship's captains and geographers of the day were beginning to grow doubtful. It was at this point, its game of hide and seek, that the island decided to spark interest in itself again. 1772, certain Danjon, second in command of the Bougainville, reported he had found the island and fixed its precise position. During a violent storm, April 27, 1772, he sighted the island and even completed a rough sketch of its outline. Well, hooked once again, the French government ordered the Chevalier de Saint Felix of the Eure de Bergère to hoist anchor immediately and accompanied by another ship to set sail for the spot indicated by Danjon. 1773, the Chevalier confessed his defeat. He said the island simply did not exist at that location. That same year, there was another fruitless attempt made by the Étoile du Matin, and a few years later, French seaman Kerguelen churned up the sea almost inch by inch, but didn't find anything. The island wasn't receiving visitors and was evidently incommunicado. Finally, in 1782, Fourville de Grenville applied for a 10-year concession on the island. It was granted, though his expedition never took place. After de Grenville's failure even to start searching, the island was conceded to Advice de Rousseau in 1787. Unfortunately, the French Revolution intervened before he could get underway, but Napoleon's accession to power in 1799 ended the revolution and freed de Rousseau for his expedition. And though he covered the area for miles around, frustration and defeat eventually overcame him as well. And that was the last attempt made by the French to find and annex St. Juan. Shortly after that, their power in the Indian Ocean was broken, and then the triumphant English made no effort to discover this mysterious island that had so frustrated their foes. Amateur sleuths and seasoned sailors have striven for an explanation for the St. Juan enigma. If it was a volcanic mass rising and falling beneath the waves is one explanation. Also, the possibility of human error. In the case of St. Juan, no, the latter seems improbable. Too many searched too hard and too unrelentingly for us to consider the island was somehow overlooked. Nor is it likely St. Juan was a floating island. These are most closely associated with lakes, although they're unknown in salt water. Floating islands rise from the deep and, being unanchored, change positions constantly until they return to where they came from. Other investigators blame the problem on the Admiralty itself. It's not all uncommon, according to these researchers, for clerks to put imaginary islands on the charts, naming them after their family and friends. And if these imaginary islands were on untraveled routes, it'd be centuries before their reception was discovered. However, in the specific case of St. Juan de Lisbon, the theory is that it generally accepted today as the island was invented by Arabian pirates to confuse the Portuguese, giving St. Juan de Lisboa as their place of rendezvous and storehouse for their booty. They could use secluded spots on other islands without fear of attack. At the conclusion of the article in the Occult Review, Neil speculated upon the mirage aspect of vanishing islands and moves on to the psychic realm. He wondered if a mirage might be the image of a primal island as it was before sinking back into the watery depths. Well, the actuality was once again covered by the waves. Its essence might now and then clothe itself in all its old verdure, its mountain peaks, its blue bays, become visible to some eye, especially attuned to the invisible. Makes you glad to think that somewhere out there lies an island where under Deccan and his ghostly crew can land to stretch their limbs now and then after being buffeted for endless years by the currents of the tempest that crowd the sea around the Cape of Storms. St. Juan de Lisbon may be like one of those phantom cities of Spanish America, swallowed up centuries ago by earthquakes, but reappeared at long intervals to delude travelers. Okay, from Vanishing Islands, let's talk about something I've heard discussed a time or two. About people who walk into the past. I'm going to start with a story of an individual who got off late one night, drive along his regular route that he took to and from his job every day. And suddenly he realized he didn't recognize any of the buildings he was driving past. Well, he suddenly thought maybe he'd taken a wrong turn, but he'd lived in that area for 7 years and he knew it pretty well. He didn't sound like he could have taken a wrong turn on a route that he drives twice a day, 6 days a week. Well, everything seemed quiet. In fact, he thought it seemed too quiet. Turned on the car radio, got only static. There was only one other car out that night, and it was an old one, really old, parked in front of a diner that had the name Henry's above the door. Then he got to the intersection, had a funny feeling like going through cool water. Well, from that point forward, he knew he was on the right track. He knew where he was and knew where he should have been the whole time. Well, he's driven that route a couple of thousand times and never, at any time after that, seen the diner Henry's. He asked around at the mill, but nobody had heard of a diner that had that name anywhere in town. So his question was, did he drive into another dimension that night, or did he drive down that street the way it might have been several years ago? Well, if anybody asked, he wasn't drinking. Well, from time to time, it seems that in some way, not yet understood, certain individuals have suddenly found themselves in restored scenes of the past. Now, such claims bring up all sorts of weighty questions. For instance, if the past returns, where does the present go? Now, if the individual in question was really driving down a street that had actually existed several years before, where did the street that currently exists disappear to? Was it possible for one time dimension to operate simultaneously alongside of or within another? But the question has been asked again and again in numerous time travel science fiction stories. Can somebody from one time dimension interact with somebody from another time dimension? What would have happened if the individual who told that story run over and killed somebody from the earlier time period in which he appears to have been driving? On most trips on the time track, inhabitants of the earlier time period seem to take no notice at all of folks from the present. They observe a dramatic battle scene or a quaint country fair. Seems the observer didn't actually step into the past. Rather, some as yet unfathomed manner, a scene from the past is recreated in precise photographic detail, as if some ethereal motion picture had been activated and projected on some kind of atmospheric screen. Well, if energy, like matter, is indestructible, and the vibrations of every word and deed ever uttered or enacted might still echo in the psychic ether, in the same manner that the emotions of certain individuals might seem to permeate a room or a house and cause a ghost that can be seen by those possessing telepathic ability, so certain emotionally charged scenes of the past might become imprinted upon the ether and reactivated by those individuals with the proper attunement. Nearly everybody has observed that some locales definitely have built up their own atmospheres over the years. And such auras might provoke definite sensations of uneasiness or fear or discomfort or even happiness. And if such trips on a time track are merely some kind of super panoramic cinemascope ghost, then they're exceedingly solid, hardly the ectoplasmic wisp of spooky stuff to make up the denizens of traditional hauntings. There are testimonials from people who have walked into offices from another era, driven on roads that no longer exist, and witnessed battles and fistfights from previous decades. In one classic case, a young lady named Miss Edith Oliver found herself observing an English village fair on a rainy night in October 1916. She had driven off the main road and traveled along stone avenues to the megaliths near Avebury, spent time watching laughing townsfolk walking merrily about, and resumed her drive from Devizes to Swindon in Wiltshire. Well, it wasn't until 9 years later that Miss Oliver had the occasion to revisit Avebury. At this point in time, she not only learned the village fairs had been abolished in 1850, but the particular avenue on which she had driven had disappeared before 1800. Well, if we accept her testimony, then we have to accept the disturbing fact that bits and pieces of the past may return again from time to time and resume physical reality, at least temporarily. A few years ago, Russell Kirk told a story to the Los Angeles Times concerning his quest for a lost street. According to Kirk, he discovered the quaint little street one night in 1949 while exploring the ancient English city of York in order to kill some time between trains. As he was rushing back to the station, he happened to glance down a short street that was lined with beautiful 17th and 18th century houses. These handsomely kept homes rose flush with the sidewalk, and dimly lighted street looked as enchanting and inviting as a scene from a fairy tale. Well, he had to catch a train. He didn't have any time to dally. However much as he'd like to have spent time wandering along that picturesque street, made himself a promise to come back to York in a few months and indulge himself in a long leisurely stroll down that enticing street. Well, he's stated that he's been back to York at least once every year since 1949. He vowed that he's now thoroughly familiar with every street, lane, and practically every house in York. He's yet to rediscover that quaint, beautiful little street. In a deteriorated section of York, he's found the remnants of a once elegant street that resembles the one he glimpsed so briefly that night in 1949. That quarter's called St. Saviour Gate, and the clergyman of York told Kirk that section's been desolate since about 1914. The bombs of World War II shattered what few buildings remain standing. And he admitted he's often wondered what might have happened if he decided to miss his London train that night and wander onto that street. What might have occurred if he'd stopped to knock on the doors on one of those delightful houses? Would he have stepped into another dimension of time and closed the door upon his own era? In August of 1967, issue of Fate magazine carried an interesting letter from Carolyn Becker, a time tripper from Ebenezer, New York. She said, when we built our new home 5 years ago, our lot on Sunbriar Drive in Ebenezer, New York had originally been part of the Seneca Indian Reservation on the night of February 22nd, 1966. She went for a walk with her dog along the Cazenovia Creek. Suddenly, out of nowhere, came the howl of a strange dog. Her own dog froze, his ears pricked, his tail went high, and his hackles rose up. Then on the creek bank appeared a tall pole decorated with cloth strips of vivid colors. A buckskin-clad Indian wearing a strange headdress was strangling a beautiful white dog. She said, as I watched, he wrapped its limp body in bright-colored strips of cloth and wound strands of wampum around the animal's broken neck. Dimly, I saw glowing campfires and throbbing drums, and the smell of tobacco smoke permeated my senses. Well, as she stood there, the scene faded, and she shivered in the snow, her own dog whimpering fearfully against her leg. Later, she learned that somehow time had turned backward, letting her witness the Seneca New Year Jubilee ceremony, in which a pure white dog was sacrificed for the tribe's sin. Well, she claimed that the last time the ceremony took place on those grounds was in 1841, a date she determined by searching the records of the reservation. Another individual who drives a truck across the Midwest Plains wrote to tell of his coming up on an old wagon train late one night. She said, I've been reading hard about this story, but I know what I saw. We saw teams of oxen tugging a heavy Conestoga wagon. Men, women, and children trudging along behind or beside the big wagons. Dogs trotting and nipping at the heels of the horses ridden by a few armed men. Now, some folks have said if it really was a wagon train, what was it doing traveling at night? Or would they camped in a circle like in the movies? Well, maybe some kind of force march or something. The people all looked beat. He said, I could see their faces in the moonlight. It was all that clear. He said, I had the feeling if I'd have stopped. He said, I slowed down, but I didn't stop. I could have heard the creaking of harnesses and the squeaking of those big wheels. I know a lot of other drivers who've seen weird things on the late night runs across the plains. Well, in August of 1941, Leonard Hall and a number of companions were fishing and camping on the western Current River in the Ozarks. Sometime before dawn, Hall was awakened with the sounds of voices. Startled, he opened his eyes and saw figures moving around a roaring fire about 100 yards from his tent. As he looked around him, he was even more amazed to see that the clearing on the beach was ringed by a dozen campfires. Most of the shadow figures were easily recognizable as Indians, naked except for breechcloths. He heard the occasional stomp of a horse's hoof, the murmur of voices speaking in many alien tongues. Some of the speech patterns are identifiable as Spanish. And he blinked his eyes in wonderment as he noticed that a number of the men seated around the campfires wore the rusted armor of Spanish conquistadors. But he convinced himself he's not having a wild dream and also suffered some kind of mental deterioration. In either event, he didn't want to awaken his companions to get any kind of confirmation that night. So he crawled back into his bedroll and managed to get back to sleep. When he woke up the next morning, he couldn't find any trace of the phantom campers and didn't bother to relate his bizarre dream to his friends. Nevertheless, he was curious about the strange experience, so he decided to do some research. It wasn't until 1956 that he gave his eerie story to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. His studies had disclosed the fact that in August of 1541, bands of conquistadors under the leadership of De Soto and Coronado had actually been in the Ozark area of the Current River. It happened, and exactly 400 years later, Hall and his friends had camped on the very ground where a party of gold-hunting Spaniards and Indian guides had built their own campfires. Such a thing can happen. We may at this time, in our amassing of scientific knowledge, only wonder what strange laws of physics or superphysics permitted Leonard Hall to see flames reflecting off tarnished armor 400 years after the initial stimulus response had been transmitted. It is noteworthy that the Spaniards and their Indian guides took no notice of Leonard Hall and his friends. Different dimensions may overlap, but never, it appears, can their inhabitants interact. The story of Brigadoon offers us a story in words and music about two lovers from different times becoming romantically and eternally involved. Such a dramatic fraternization between dwellers of different time tracks of necessity remain in the realm of musical fantasy. The old science fiction plot of time traveler who accidentally murders his own grandfather, thereby eliminating himself in the future present, offers us an excellent, if involved example of just why denizens of various dimensions of time can never be permitted to physically confront one another. Just be too darn complicated. If that time traveler murdered a young single man who'd be his grandfather one day, then the murderer could have been born in the future and therefore would have been able to return to the past and murder his grandfather. In our physical plane, the past must always precede the future. Maybe that time is really only an eternal now to the psychically gifted, to the prophets and the seers, but we live this daily life on the material plane and in the physical dimension. Time has to pass in sequence. Judging by the experiences of people mentioned in our various stories, it appears that some men and women do experience a doubling back or a re-emergence of scenes from the past. But at no time has an individual from one plane of time really been able to establish any kind of contact with a person from the other dimension that we know about. And some restored scenes of another time have been exceedingly dramatic. In England, the famous Battle of Edge Hill was refought by spectral soldiers on several consecutive weekends during the Christmas season of 1642. And King Charles II sent three of his most trusted officers to investigate. In two consecutive nights, the king's emissaries watched the phantom battle and recognized several of their comrades who had been killed during the fight. August 4th, 1951, two young ladies and women vacationing in deep France were awakened before dawn by the sounds of shell fire and dive bombing and scraping of landing craft hitting the beach. 9 years before that, nearly 1,000 young Canadians had been slaughtered in an ill-fated deep raid. The record the Englishwoman kept at the times of the ebb and flow of the battle was identical to the minute with accounts of the raid kept in the British War Office. Terrified woodcutters and soldiers on maneuvers have reported coming face to face with phantoms of fighting and dying men on the small island corridor, where in the early days of World War II, a handful of American and Filipino troops fought vainly to stop the Japanese advance against the Philippine Islands. And in May of 1967, there was an issue of Fate magazine that carried a reader's account of a much quieter but equally amazing and inadvertent misstep on the time track. J.P.J. Chapman of Poole, Dorset, England, told of the day in April 1966 he and his wife had gone in search of some spring blossoms to decorate a charity event. About a half mile from their home was a broad avenue heavily lined with trees and rhododendrons. Years before, there was an exclusive residential district on this spot, but today there's only mainly some apartment buildings. 3 vacant lots of rather extensive acreage have been largely left unattended and allowed to revert to natural growth. As Chapman suggested, they search these vacant lots for any flowering shrubs she might be able to use for the charity event. While she went to examine a large flowering cherry tree, her husband stood looking at some primroses. When he looked up, he saw the apartment buildings had disappeared. He could see his wife in the distance and everything seemed perfectly normal, but the apartment buildings were gone. And then he said there was something else that happened. Everything changed, a vast open nothingness surrounding me. I hadn't lost my orientation because the sun was shining and it gave me my bearings, but apparently I'd entered another dimension. So the question became how I could get out. He deduced that the exit must be his point of entry, so he crossed two sticks on the ground to mark his position. Then he began to walk toward where the apartment buildings should have been. He walked on and on. No apartment buildings, no roads, no traffic, just a vast open space and no sign of any kind of life. Well, so his wife became worried about him. He hastened back to where he left the crossed sticks. He saw his wife near him and spoke to her. She exclaimed, "You startled me. Where have you been? I called you and searched for you and I couldn't find you." Well, he said at that point everything was back to normal. The apartment buildings were where they were supposed to be. The shrubs, the trees, the traffic was once again visible. He said he did find one odd thing. The ground where he'd been standing was soft and bare. He could see his footprints going toward the flats, but they suddenly ended as if he had stepped off the ground into thin air. And his return path started in the same manner as the outgoing marks suddenly had vanished. He said, the question remains, had I stepped into the past, the future, or another dimension altogether? That's the great question, I guess you could say. Well, from people who stepped into the past, let's talk about flying rocks and falling flesh. August 27th, 1968, motors traveling between Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo on the Vila Dutra highway were astonished to see a strange rainfall off the road in the distance. It could be rain because there were no clouds, and the substance was too dark to be ordinary water. Well, when a police deputy named Marcondes Ferrero arrived on the spot, he found an area of 1 square kilometer literally strewn with meat and blood. Sao Paulo newspapers reported pieces of flesh from about 2 feet apart and varying in size from 2 to 7 inches. The meat was spongy in texture and violet in color. It was accompanied by drops of blood. Well, police, of course, were at a loss for an explanation of the strange sky falls. The sky had been clear on the day the debris descended. No aircraft reported in the area either prior to, during, or immediately after the dropping. Not any birds noted in the sky. With no reasonable clue as to the source of the meat, the police ended the affair by discreetly removing the samples and conveniently forgetting the whole thing. September 1966, the curious lump of charred material dropped onto the farm of Carl Rutherford near Windfall, Indiana. First, it was thought to be the chunk was maybe part of a huge meteor seen over the Midwest, but apparently checking by chemist Michael Lipsitz at the university convinced Rutherford that the material was not from a meteor. The farmer also established the chunk couldn't be furnace ashes. He didn't use coal. The conclusion? Nobody knows what it was or how it got there. Or if anybody does know, they're not telling anybody. Maybe his charred material was a distant relative to the equally strange substance that fell to the ground October 8, 1967 in Putnam County, New York. It's about 3:30 in the morning when Patrolman Gene Blaney of the Brewster, New York police force saw this big glob of fire falling from the sky. As it hit the earth, it exploded, and he said he saw balls of flame 7 or 8 feet tall shoot up into the air. White smoke came rolling out of it like clouds, and I thought it would never stop. Mysterious object falling from the sky had been with us for eons, and for a long time, nobody even ventured an explanation of the phenomenon, causing this rather uncomfortable hole in the existing technology to be completely ignored. Range of flesh and fish and frogs and rocks were relegated to the back pages of the newspaper and considered oddities. That's when they were considered at all. About the turn of the 20th century, Charles Fort took it upon himself to bring these well-ignored facts out into the open. In 1919, he published The Book of the Damned, with a note that while the damned, I mean what science has excluded. And suddenly a rather large spotlight was thrown on what scientists had hoped people would forget. Science is now forced to recognize the existence of skyfalls, but instead of changing its understanding to include the phenomena has been pushed and shoved to fit the existing structure. So some of the improbable scientific explanations are baffling in the extreme. Let's talk about the case of Fred Koch, professional photographer whose specialty is lightning. May 3rd, 1952, he was in Bingham, New Mexico, taking pictures of a storm. As the wind increased, dirt began to swirl the car's ground and up into the sky. He jumped into his car where he planned to wait out the storm. Well, the afternoon had been hot and the earth was dry and parched. Suddenly the heavens opened up and it rained steadily for nearly 2 hours, quenching the thirst of everything in sight. Well, when the sun finally came out, Koch left his car and walked out into the desert. In minutes, the sun was beaming down as mercifully as before, and the sand had sucked up all the water. It looked as though there had been no rain at all for the whole area, with the exception of the dry bed arroyos, which had dried up. And then in the arroyos, as you might guess, there were a few small pools of water. As he walked along, he noticed something strange. The entire area was dotted with hundreds of tiny dead fish, all about an inch long and very soft. Slightest pressure crushed them. In the arroyos, where the small pools of water remained, some of the fish were alive and swimming. Unfortunately, these also met the same fate as their brothers on the sand. As the sun drank up the water, he was left surrounded by the smell of fish and feeling as though he was standing on a beach. They took several pictures of the fish, some of which were published in a local newspaper. These photos listed the response of a biology group from Lubbock, Texas. They traveled to the area and looked at a great number of the fish. They reported that the fish had prominent eyes and weren't kin to any of the several species of fish known to inhabit underground pools, rejecting the suggestion that the fish had come up from a 150-foot well nearby. No other lakes or rivers or ponds within an appreciable distance. Well, the whole affair began to attract official interest, as evidenced by the large array of entomologists and biologists and ornithologists and botanists and archaeologists who arrived in mass. Theories and explanations are rife, but nothing seemed to really click. The most logical one, working within the framework of the facts available, was that the sun had drawn up both fish and water from a large body of water as far north as Colorado. And as the storm moved south, a low pressure point developed over the hot arid desert, causing the clouds to empty their load of fish and water onto the rain belt about 2 miles wide. Well, that theory does sound good, but Fred Koch did some further investigating, discovered the rain belt had been approximately 2 miles wide where he had been, but further south it was a lot wider. And the fish had only fallen within the area of 1 square mile. So how do fish suddenly appear in the middle of the desert? How do they suddenly rain down on the Pentagon Parkway in Dallas, Texas? 2 little girls named Martha Brumley and Barbara Williams collected about 40 fish in a jar, all about 3 inches long. These fish that fell July 18, 1958 were dark gray with a reddish gold spots and red tails. Same pond theory for Alfred Cook was released by the Weather Bureau. Dallas News called the theory unbelievable. They would prefer to call it a miracle. So what caused 5-inch-long salamanders to fall in Port Hall, North Dakota in October 1949? Local inhabitants who'd never seen salamanders before didn't even know what they were. So did the same stork that brought Port Hall salamanders deposit a crawfish 6 feet up in a peach tree in Everton, Georgia. A drop of goldfish down Ms. Walker's chimney in Whitechurch, Bristol, England. Or fling a live minnow 3 inches long onto the windshield of Frank Luckel's car in San Diego, California. How many seagulls or other birds, strong winds, and rainfall can be used to explain away such phenomena before somebody finds the explanation a bit too pat, a bit too aware of too many puzzling facts? By far the most common of these baffling visitors from the skies are a large chunk of ice falls. Well, most uncanny aspect of the ice falls, it's almost deliberate aim. March 11th, 1966, a block of ice weighing between 25 and 30 pounds sailed through the air at an angle and settled to a resounding halt atop a parked car. Passers-by immediately gathered around the unfortunate car, and its owners rushed out to the nearby restaurant where they were having lunch. Fred Haynes looked at the dent in the roof of his car and wondered if there was an insurance company in the world that covered strange blocks of ice coming in for a landing. And the shattered ice fragments were tested by Dr. Cecil Marburger for radioactivity, but the results were negative. Witnesses claimed the ice was frosty, but didn't resemble commercial ice. March 25th, 1965, Ms. Lorraine Nichols of San Mateo, California, sat watching television with her family. All at once, they heard what sounded like the detonation of a bomb. Children scream and pointed at her mother, who didn't show that she shared their fright. Rushing up to the kitchen, she ran next door to call the police. When the police arrived, they found a large chunk of ice measuring about 1 square foot had come through the roof of Ms. Nichols' house. That ice chunk had missed the Nichols by just a scant 16 feet. Ice chips the size of baseballs circled the house for a 150-foot perimeter. These mysterious ice falls was commonly believed to come from passing aircraft. But in the cases we've covered so far, there are no airplanes seen or heard over the area, either before, during, or after the time the ice crashed down. Invariably, the aviation industries assured the population that there were no icing conditions at the pertinent times. But if the ice falls don't come from planes passing overhead, where do they come from? Do they come from outer space? Or could they maybe come from flying saucers? Scientists won't commit any further than the airplane theory. A lot of people feel they have the right to know the complete answer. If you want to know more, if you were somebody like Ronald Phipps and a chunk of ice weighing several pounds put a hole in your roof, how about if you were a passerby on Art Street in Brownsville, Pennsylvania, when a chunk of ice weighing about 25 pounds crashed into the sidewalk? Or maybe you were Dominic Chigalupo of Madison Township, New Jersey, and a 70-pound cake of ice exploded through your roof, totally demolishing 2 kitchen chairs. It's interesting to note that along with this case, when the airlines are blamed for the crash, the area airports declared that airliners do not carry ice. Clearly, a better explanation has to be found. Something in our skies is playing havoc with our ecology. If there is physical reason for this phenomenon, its discovery would certainly aid our understanding of physics. If there's another reason, such as flying saucers, we better assume that our space brothers are not simply attempting to amuse us with their antics. Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. We're out of time. We'll be back tomorrow and talk about more weird unsolved mysteries. Till then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a truly great